Hello class, in this short screen recording of a Prezi presentation, I'm going to give you some basic information about the federal court system. So we're going to call this the federal courts and jurisdiction, and I'm going to be taking a look at, closer look at just some of the most important things, some of the important features about the federal court system. So we're going to walk our way through these three and then the final one. It'll only take us a moment. So just as a refresher of some of the things that we've learned in this course, or we should have learned in the course, let's take a look at the Articles of Confederation. Remember, the Articles of Confederation are the very first constitution that the United States operated under. The Articles were created toward the end of the Revolutionary War, and it's really what the 13 states operated under toward the last half of the Revolutionary War and the period immediately after that. So the Articles of Confederation, they didn't have a federal court system. You may recall that all the Articles really created was a legislative branch. Under the Articles, the American people didn't have a federal judicial branch. They didn't have a federal executive branch. And so essentially, each one of the states, each one of the 13 states had their own court system. And under the original organization of the United States, under the Articles, the Americans were dependent upon the state court systems. So the suits between people from different states were addressed in state courts, and this was perceived as an opportunity for bias. And also keep this in mind that the early Americans, they knew that they needed to strengthen the national government, and so whenever they proposed giving that national government more power in the Constitution, and even proposing an executive branch, they thought at the same time that it'd be best to go ahead and create a judicial branch as well. If, among other things, the judicial branch can sort of act as a mediator between the legislative and executive branches. So suits related to national laws under the Articles were tried at the state court level. Again, there was no federal court system, no such thing as a U.S. Supreme Court under the Articles. So the Constitution then, which was drafted in 1787 and then eventually ratified, replaced the Articles of Confederation. And when the early Americans, or 13 states, ratified the Constitution, they ratified the creation and the existence of a federal judicial branch. So the U.S. Constitution then does create a federal court system, and in this module, we're working our way through this. The federal judicial branch is created and addressed in Article 3. It's actually a very, very short article of the three branches that are created in the Constitution. The judicial branch gets the less amount of ink, and you're going to be learning some of these things as you work your way through this module. As I've already noted in previous pages or previous lectures, Alexander Hamilton just straightly stated that he considered the judicial branch to be the weakest of the three, and I won't go into why he said that. You can go and take a look at that quote that I've inserted into your course, or if this is a live class that I've shared with you at the beginning of this module. That is a quote of Alexander Hamilton. So the only court that's created in the Constitution itself is the Supreme Court. And as you work your way through this module, you'll see that there are, of course, other layers, other courts below. I described the federal court system as really a three-level system. Up at the top is the Supreme Court, but the other two were not created by the Constitution. So the U.S. District Court's not created specifically by the Constitution. The U.S. Courts of Appeals, aka the Circuit Courts, not created by the U.S. Constitution. But there is what's referred to as enabling language, and that enabling language in the Constitution does give Congress, the legislative branch, authority to create other courts below the Supreme Court, and that's exactly what they did. First chance they could, they created courts below the Supreme Court. But again, the U.S. Supreme Court is the only court that's specifically created by the U.S. Constitution. So the jurisdiction of the federal courts is defined by Article 3, Section 2, Clause 1. And I do encourage my students to go there to look at the grant of jurisdiction. But let's take a closer look at that. I think I'm going to take you to that now. So here, federal court jurisdiction. All I'm doing here is just summarizing. You can see that I'm giving you 5 circles around the larger circle. But jurisdiction, what exactly does that mean? That term can be applied to a lot of different settings. But what we're looking at in terms of what that term means within the context of law, if you say that a court has jurisdiction, what you're saying is that it's been given the power to decide a particular case, to resolve a particular type of case. It has the power and authority over a particular subject matter. So if a court doesn't have jurisdiction, then it can issue all the orders that it wants. But if there's not a law that grants it jurisdiction, and in this case the U.S. Constitution, which is a super law, unless there is a law that grants a court jurisdiction, then the order that court issues is really just a wasted piece of paper. So Article 3, Section 2, Clause 1 gives several categories of cases the federal courts have jurisdiction over. So this is just something that's right in the Constitution. And if a case does not fall into one of these categories, by default, the case must be tried in a state court system. And I'm going to give you some of these categories, but let me elaborate on this. So in the state of Texas, we've got somewhere around 1,100 different courts in Texas. All right, that's how many we have. It's over 1,000. Those are all state-related courts. Then you have 4 courts that belong to the federal court system. Texas is divided up into 4 judicial districts. So you have the northern, southern, eastern, and western judicial districts, or districts of Texas. And in each one of those districts, as a U.S. district court. So in other words, we've got 1,100 courts in the state of Texas. 4 of them belong to the federal court system. The others belong to the state of Texas. Okay, so what about those 4? What kind of cases can be actually heard in those 4 trial courts that belong to the federal court system? Well, that's what we're looking at here. So we'll start off with the one on the top here. So if a let's go back here. Let me rewind. So if you have somebody suing somebody else, one entity suing another entity, and the subject matter is about the U.S. Constitution, then these courts have jurisdiction. Okay, and there's an example of some of them. In the state of Texas, a lot of times people make appeals when they've been found guilty, and they'll make their appeals based upon their claim that they've not been, their rights in Amendments 4, 5, 6, and 8 of the U.S. Constitution, the Bill of Rights, weren't protected. But that's a suit related to the U.S. Constitution, and so the federal courts, at least in theory, have some jurisdiction over that. It's not unusual for a person to be given the death penalty, that judgment by a Texas state court, only for that person to make an appeal to the federal court system. Okay. Cases arising under laws produced by Congress. So if you have a law produced by Congress, and Congress has specific meaning. Congress is the federal legislative branch. That's U.S. senators and U.S. representatives. If somebody sues another individual, and the basis of that suit is a law produced by Congress, and I'll give you an example here, that would be something that the federal courts would have jurisdiction over. One state sues another state. And this isn't going to happen very often, but it does happen. One state sues another state. So let's just take a couple of the states. Let's take North Carolina and South Carolina, just as an example. Let's say that a river runs through North Carolina into South Carolina, and on out into the Atlantic Ocean. What if North Carolina decided to dam that river up? Think about how dependent South Carolina may very well be on that river flow for transportation, perhaps even as a source of water, right? So you can see why South Carolina in that state may want to sue North Carolina to get some relief regarding the damming of this river. But that's just one example. So it is possible for one state to sue another state. Let's look at another one. Cases related to incidents at sea. These are called maritime cases. So one of my friends who used to practice law, this was his specialty. He was a maritime attorney in the city of Houston. This is pretty much all he did. So he was in the federal courts all the time. But if you've got a couple of ships that, for instance, run into each other off the coast of Galveston, that's a maritime case. Or if you have an explosion on, say, some sort of oil platform out there, that's a maritime case. It's not on land. And the U.S. Constitution says those sorts of cases can be heard by a federal court. And then one of the problems that I noted earlier, one of the reasons, one of the weaknesses that was deemed to exist in the country when we were operating under the Articles of Confederation is that since there wasn't a federal court system, a national court system, and we were dependent on state courts, well, if somebody from Pennsylvania wanted to sue somebody from New York, you would have to end up in one of those two state courts, either a Pennsylvania state court or a New York state court. And you can see the potential for bias there. And they were very, very concerned back then that bias not exist. Okay, so let's back out of this. And let me just make one other statement and we'll be through. So then federal courts resolve conflicts in the form of lawsuits, and in this capacity they must interpret and apply both laws and the Constitution. Okay, I think that's all we're going to do for this one, and you'll be advancing to another module page, or perhaps if this is a live class, then you'll be ready for the next class day.